with the riots and looting across English cities this week. Why did they happen? Was it the cuts, soft policing, a broken society? And can a look at the numbers tell us more? Here's Harriet Harman, Labour's deputy leader.
There is a sense that young people feel they're not being listened to. That is not to justify violence. But I think that when you've got the trebling of tuition fees, they should think again about that. When you've got the EMA being taken away, when you've got jobs being cut and youth unemployment rising, and they're shutting the job centre in Camberwell, well, you should think again about that, because this is going to cost money. This does not help. All of this does not help reduce the deficit.
Oh, OK, well, let's try to figure this out. Here's Phil Kemp. Phil, you've been hard at work on all this. What have you found?
Well, Harriet Harman seemed to be suggesting that budget cuts were linked to the riots. But the journalist Toby Young, writing in his Daily Telegraph blog, rejects that argument, and he quotes figures to prove it. He says that average monthly public expenditure in the year ending June 2011 was actually higher than the year ending June 2010.
So he's basically saying that there haven't been any cuts yet. Is that true?
Yeah, well, basically, it is true that even adjusting for CPI inflation, the government did spend more last year than Labour did the year before. So Toby Young, yeah, he's right about that. OK,
well, I'd like to look a little closer at this. We've heard this kind of claim before, and actually Toby Young cites as his source Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. We interviewed Fraser about this last series. Now, a couple of things are worth mentioning. The first is that, sure, year on year, spending was slightly higher in the most recent year, but over the past 6 months there has been a distinct decline in spending. And the second thing to say is actually two big chunks of government spending. They're roughly the same size as each other. So one is departmental spending, so that includes defence, the NHS, police, and the other is what's called annually managed expenditure. That's interest on the national debt, pensions, unemployment benefit. Now, departmental spending's being cut, annually managed spending is rising, and the two are roughly balancing each other out.
Which raises the point that you can't really blame cuts in general. You want to look at specific spending, which might be expected to affect the mood in inner city Manchester or Birmingham and so on.
And that's exactly what Harriet Harman tried to do. So she pointed to cuts in education maintenance allowance, the rise in university tuition fees, and cuts to youth services as possible causes. Now, what's going on here?
Well, the EMA isn't being scrapped until September, and tuition fees aren't being raised until next September. So if there is an effect there, it's an anticipation of cuts that haven't happened yet. But what's happening to youth services is certainly worth paying attention to. I looked at Haringey Council, which includes Tottenham, where the trouble all started. Their youth services budget has taken a cut of £1.6 million this year. That's down from just under £3 million last year. And it goes down even more next year, so they'll be spending less than £1 million. And that's a cut of around 70%. It's a massive cut.
It is massive. What is it per teenager?
What?
And I'm teasing. I've looked this up already. OK, so there are about 20,000 teenagers in Haringey, roughly. Now, a cut of £1.5 million to youth services is a cut of £75 per teenager. So, that might be part of the explanation. Phil, as the new boy, I should remind you of the first rule of more or less.
Do not talk about more or less.
No, that's the second rule. The first rule of more or less is correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Just because youth services have been cut in one of the areas where there have been riots doesn't prove that the cuts in youth services caused the riots. Might have done, might not have done. We need to know, for instance, the youth clubs were actually doing some good. We wouldn't have been better off, say, giving teenagers £75 vouchers for trainers or something. And we don't have that evidence yet.
But there's another argument, which is that Britain has a class of disaffected young people, and they're people with little income and no job prospects.
So these are people with little to lose?
Yeah, people with little to lose. And it seems reasonable to assume that, at the very least, the existence of those people makes rioting more likely. And the numbers of people who you could describe as members of this disaffected group tend to grow during years of recession. And that's pretty much the argument that London's ex-mayor Ken Livingstone made on the BBC's news channel.
This is anger and it's disaffection. Why is it suddenly happening now? We've been broadly riot-free for nearly 3 decades. We had a huge upsurge of rioting in the early 1980s when we were going through a deep recession. We're having another set of that now.
Ken Livingstone, is there any firm evidence that Ken's onto something?
Well, coincidentally, the economic historian Hans Joachim Fult has just written a working paper looking at the link between budget cuts and disorder. And he says that reductions in public spending are a very powerful predictor for unrest.
On average, in a European country, over the last 90 years, in an average year, you have about 1.5 incidents that we look at. So the kind of incidents we're interested in: politically motivated demonstrations, riots, assassinations, general strikes, and attempts at revolutionary overthrow of the existing order. That pretty much doubles if you go to budget cuts of 3% or more of GDP. And in between, it's pretty stable. We can't explain all the variation in unrest over time and between different countries, but it's pretty clear that if you cut more, you're going to get more instability. And the size of the effect differs between different countries. So prior to this interview, I actually went back to the data and actually looked up how strong the link is for Britain as compared to the average of our sample. And it's quite interesting. So the average in Britain is higher. Even if nothing happens, you don't have any austerity measures, there's more unrest, there's more incidents according to our measure. But then as you cut, the response is also much greater on top of that. So that suggests that Britain, according to our measure of social instability, actually on average shows more types of unrest, but it's also more responsive to the way the government conducts its budget position.
That's really interesting, because some people here have been arguing that actually the cuts haven't really begun to hit at all yet. This is something that people are protesting about in anticipation of what's to come.
That may well be so. This is not at all unusual. The peak of some of these forms of unrest is actually before the actual implementation of some of these budget measures. You can think of it as a form of negotiation through street protests.
OK, that's really interesting. So austerity makes riots more likely, and the cuts don't need to have kicked in for it to happen.
I have been looking for other explanations too, and one I find quite compelling is what you might call the Lord of the Flies effect. At least that's how it's described in a book called The Pinch, which was written by the Science and Universities Minister David Willetts while he was in opposition. Now, the theory is that whenever you have a population bulge, so either lots more babies being born in a baby boom or rapid immigration, then there's the likelihood of unrest as the number of young people outnumbers the old. The American sociologist Professor Jack Goldstone started researching this to see whether demographics help make sense of world events like the revolutions in France and in Russia.
The data just started to fall into place. In each of these great revolutions, there had been a generation or two large population surge, which created a younger population, a population that was outgrowing the ability of the economy to provide jobs and services. When a society goes through a sudden surge in population and a huge increase in the number of young people, society has to adapt. And if it doesn't adapt, you get problems on multiple levels that are very difficult for governments and lead to eruptions of popular protest.
But there's a problem with your theory, because we have an ageing population here, don't we? So does that mean that the demographics can't be used to explain what's happened recently here?
What you have in the UK, I think, is pockets within the broader society that are concentrating larger numbers of young unemployed people. That is, certain neighborhoods seem to have been targets for migrants to settle. They seem to be attracting large numbers of people compared to the general slowdown in growth. For example, I was able to look at some of the population data on the Tottenham parliamentary seat, and it turned out that that particular district had seen a population surge of almost 8% in the first half of the 2000s. That's about 3 times the population growth rate of the UK as a whole. And that's usually associated with a higher proportion of young people.
OK, so that's approaching an argument that actually it's nothing to do with the cuts or any other grievance. It's just population figures driving it. Now, I can understand people's desire to want to find a clear reason for what's been happening, but what if there isn't one? Phil, all due respect to you, I've been looking at this question too, with the help of Duncan Watts, mathematical sociologist. He's now the principal research scientist at Yahoo. Now, Duncan wrote the book Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. See what you make of this.
It's not a coincidence that we see riots and social violence in sort of bursts. You don't see individual people turning to violence. You see them all doing it together. The fact that other people are doing things sort of normalizes that kind of behavior. The problem with that, and we know this from decades of mathematical modeling and experiments and so on, the problem is that once you introduce this social influence into the equation, you immediately generate a huge component of unpredictability. You can have two populations that are, for all intents and purposes, identical. Everything that you can measure about them would look the same, and one of them can remain calm and the other can tip into all-out violence.
If you've got these two identical populations and very, very different outcomes, what does this make us think when we hear all these different explanations of why the riots happened? I mean, should we just dismiss them?
Just because the necessary conditions are satisfied doesn't mean that it's inevitable that you're going to see riots, and it tells you virtually nothing about how frequent and how big they're going to be and precisely where they're going to happen. If you look at some of the people who have been profiled, it's sort of like, well, he's 19 years old and he only learned to read 3 years ago and he has no sort of hope for the future and he doesn't trust the government and that's why he's doing this. That was true of this guy 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 weeks ago. It'll be true of him in a year from now. And he's not rioting at all those times. Clearly, there's some other very, very important factor that is responsible for the particular timing and location. And that is not accounted for by the kinds of explanations that we give.
Duncan Watts, Principal Research Scientist at the internet company Yahoo,